Good afternoon, explorers, and welcome back to another episode of the Aquarium Online Academy. My name is Ty, and I'm coming to you live from the Aquarium of Pacific here in Long Beach, California, and I'm really excited to be joining you today because we're going to be exploring a really amazing ocean habitat, the deep sea. Now, today, along our journey, we would love if you would join us. We are doing this as sort of a Ask a Scientist style, so we'd love to hear your questions or just hear any of the observations you have. And so if you'd like to share with us, you can use this number right below on screen, 562-286-1838. You can text that in, and then my friend Sergio, who's behind the computer, who's controlling all the magic you'll see behind me, he'll be able to relay your questions to me, and we can answer them live during our program today. Now, you are also welcome to use email, so down below is live@lbaop.org. You can go ahead and use that if emailing works better for you, and we'll also be able to check that. Now, also, if you're watching after we're live, you can still use that email to send us any of your questions because we'll check that periodically and make sure that we're able to answer any and all of your questions. All right, my friends. So, like I said, what we're exploring today is a really interesting ocean habitat, one that's filled with a lot of mystery still. There's still many, many things that we really don't know about this place, and that is the deep sea. I'm going to have my friend Sergio throw up a picture of just a deep sea habitat. And let's get our brains warmed up. What are some things that you notice about this picture in the deep sea? So go ahead, take a minute just to make some observations. This looks very different than maybe some other ocean habitats you might be more familiar with, but just go ahead and make some observations. And as you're making your observations, if you happen to be watching with somebody, feel free to share with them, or like we said, feel free to use that text line or email to let us know some of your observations. Now, while you're doing this too, I want you to imagine that you were in this habitat. Imagine if you just teleported and all of a sudden you're down here in the deep sea. What things do you think you might see? Or what do you think it might feel like? So go ahead. Imagine you've been teleported to the deep sea. What do you think it might be like? Now, what I'm noticing right away is I'm actually not seeing too many animals. Do you see any animals? We might need to look a little bit closer. But I will tell you this, there are many deep sea animals. But that is often surprising, and that was surprising to a lot of scientists because the deep sea is a very harsh environment. It's a tough place to live. And so originally we thought, well, what could possibly be down here in such harsh conditions? Today we are going to explore some of those and try and figure out how they're able to survive in this habitat. But what are some other things that you notice? Or what do you think it might feel like? Now I'm noticing that it looks pretty dark. It almost looks like this picture may have been taken with like a flash because it looks light down here, but if I look just past you, you can see it gets really, really dark really fast. What about what it might feel like? If you were teleported down to the deep sea, what do you think it might feel like to be down there? Well, why don't we do this? Let's actually go over to my whiteboard and let's write down some of these ideas, some of these challenges to maybe living in the deep sea. So, one of the things that we kind of already talked about was how dark it is, right? So when we're thinking about that, we're thinking in terms of light. There's not a lot of light down there in the deep sea. So why might that be a challenge for an animal? Why does it matter if there's not very much light? Any ideas? Well, maybe it might be harder to move or find things, right? Maybe it makes it more challenging to find your food if you can't really see. Or maybe it makes it harder to find, your friends or a mate in the deep sea because it's much, much darker. So we're going to explore some of the ways that animals deal with the lack of light down in the deep sea. But what else? Another thing that you may have thought, might be a challenge of the deep sea is how cold it is. So down in the deep sea, because there's not a lot of light like from the sun, that also means that the water is going to be much, much cooler, right? But is that always the case? Do we think that in the entire deep sea that it's always going to be cold? Well, that would be a mystery we'll solve today. Now, there's still one other challenge to the deep sea. Can you think of what that might be? That's very different from either being on land or in the shallow waters. Now, the last thing that I'm thinking of is pressure. Now, pressure. Right now, when we're standing here on land, do you think that we are under any sort of pressure? Well, we are. We are under pressure from the atmosphere, from the air. Now, the way that you know this is if you think about maybe you've ever gone on a trip or a hike or a walk and you go up high, sometimes you feel a little bit different. Maybe you feel a little, maybe even like lightheaded. Or when you have these big changes, sometimes you might feel like your ears pop. Or if you've ever gone on a plane ride, you might feel that too, your ears kind of popping. And that's because the pressure around you can change as you go up and down in elevation. Now, we are under that pressure from the air, but if you go underwater, there's even more pressure because that water, right, as you go deeper and deeper and deeper, there's more and more water on top of you that's pushing down on you. And so there's a lot of pressure the deeper you go into the ocean. So, pressure, the light, and it's very cold. Or is it? Well, that's what we're going to explore today. Let's start with the pressure part. How do animals possibly survive with so much pressure? Well, one of the ways they do that is by not having a lot of body parts that sort of respond negatively to pressure. Now, pressure on you can be really tough if you have things like tough bones or if you have any pockets of air, like for us, our lungs, right? Take a deep breath. As you're breathing in and out, you're actually bringing in more air into your lungs, in and out. But having that chamber of air in us, well, that would be really tough if we were to go underwater because that air would be compressed, it would be squeezed. And so the answer for many of these animals in the deep sea is to just not have any of these things. And so many deep sea animals are really cool animals like many different types of invertebrates or boneless animals. There are lots of deep sea jellies, deep sea squids, lots of cool animals like that who don't have that challenge because, well, they don't need it. Their body is instead made of mostly water. And so that, with maybe some special proteins in their body, can actually keep them having their shape even while they're under that large amount of pressure. Now, when it comes to fish who do have bones, there are deep sea fish. Now, in shallow waters, or at least more shallow waters, most fish are going to have something called a swim bladder. A swim bladder is like a little pocket of air, sort of like, or not a little pocket of air, but a pocket of sort of gas that they use like kind of like a floaty to control where they are in the water. Now, for many deep sea animals, if they're going to live down there, especially at the bottom of the ocean, well, they don't really need it. And so some of these deep sea fish just completely lack that swim bladder. Why don't we take a look at some interesting, cool fish in the deep sea? Now, one I want to share with you today is called a chimera. Let's see if we can take a look at a picture of a chimera. We'll make some observations. I think these are really cool and unique looking fish that share some things in common with some animals that you may be familiar with already from some other ocean habitats. So let's see if we can take a look at that one. So the chimera. Let's make some observations about this deep sea fish. What are some things that you notice? Now, I mentioned that this fish actually does have some things in common with some pretty popular other fish. Have you ever heard of sharks or stingrays before? Now, chances are, if you've watched this program before, you probably know a thing or two about sharks and rays. So what could these fish in the deep sea possibly have in common with those animals? Well, I mentioned that bones, right, for us can face that challenge of the deep pressure. But if you know anything about sharks and rays and their body and how it's a little bit different, you may know that their body is a little bit different in terms of that skeleton. Now, if you've maybe learned before, sharks and rays have a special skeleton that's made out of cartilage. So cartilage is something that we have too. You can feel it on your ears and the tip of your nose, but that cartilage you can see is much more bendy than bones, right? So for sharks and rays, in any part of the ocean, their skeleton is made of that cartilage. Chimeras are sort of like distant cousins to these animals. And one of the things that they share is actually that cartilage skeleton. So that can be an advantage for living in the deep sea. And just like other sharks and rays, these fish don't have a swim bladder. And so that allows them to not have to have that same struggle of having that pocket of gas that can be sort of compressed or squeezed as you go under pressure. What are some other things that you notice about this fish? Now, something I'm noticing for sure is it does have some really interesting body parts on it. Look on its fins. You can see that its side fins, its pectoral fins, they're pretty huge compared to the rest of its body. And that is also true for this fin up here, the dorsal fin on top. So it has some really large fins. Now, when this animal is swimming around, this fish, it sort of flaps these, sort of like wings almost, which is a little bit different than some other, like sharks and rays. Anything else stand out to you about this animal? Take a look near its face. Does anything else look like it might be, well, maybe a little bit too big for the rest of its body? This right here. These chimeras have very, very big eyeballs. Any ideas why? Why would a deep sea animal have really, really big eyes? Well, remember, there's not much light getting down into the deep sea. So some animals have opted to just have no eyes. And there are actually some different types of fish in the bottom of the ocean who just have no eyes at all. Or some might have really big eyes, like the case of the chimera, which means that if you maximize your eyes, well then even if there's only a little bit of light, well, now your eyes can be really good at least capturing that little bit of light. So these chimeras, like I said, these distant relatives to the sharks and rays are really cool deep sea fish, and I hope that you've enjoyed exploring our first deep sea animal of the day. But why don't we actually continue on, because I mentioned that there are also some sort of other animals, some invertebrates that live down in the deep sea that are quite a bit different. Now, dealing with the cold, right, can be quite challenging. I probably wouldn't want to live down there in the deep sea, but I hinted to you that it might not always be cold in these different parts of the ocean. And that's because if you go down to the deep, you might come across these special features called hydrothermal vents. Why don't we see if we can take a look at a hydrothermal vent? Because these become little mini spots where there's lots of life. Now, in the water, as you go down and there's less and less light, it's going to get much colder. But sometimes you might find something that looks like this. Now, hydrothermal vents are these parts down at the bottom of the ocean. And what happens is, it's sort of where the cold ocean water meets the magma from the earth down below. And so as cold water seeps through these little sort of cracks in the bottom, they'll actually get heated up by that magma underneath, where it can be thousands of degrees. And then because it gets heated up, it actually gets pushed out, back up through the top in the form of what we call black or white smokers. So in the case of a black smoker right here, they form sort of like chimneys. Think of like a fireplace, right? If we burn a fire down below and all that smoke comes up from the top, can be what happens here. Now, in the case of a black smoker, what's happening is that water is also coming out with what we call sulfur, which is a type of chemical that you find in the ocean, which turns it into that black color. Now, what happens is when this comes out, as you can see, well, that water nearby is no longer cold. In fact, quite the opposite. It's extremely warm. That water that comes out from here can be up to 750 degrees. Super, super warm. And so because of that, lots of animals might gravitate towards these literal hotspots where there's warmer water coming out from these vents. Why don't we see if we can take a look at a picture or video of some of these vents and see what kind of animals we might be able to spot nearby. Let's see what we can find. Now, as you go through and you find these spots, you can see here that that smoke kind of coming up here is from those black smokers. So that's all that heated water coming out with that sulfur, making it that black coloration. Now, there's actually a whole bunch of animals in these pictures, but can you find them? Any guesses as to what things in this picture are even animals? Well, in order to do that, we have to look right over here. All of these things that kind of just look like sticks or bones even that are hanging down from here, all of these are actually a type of worm. So in the deep sea, all around these hydrothermal vents where it gets really hot, around these black smokers, you often will find these tube worms. Now, tube worms are found actually in many different parts of the ocean. And the way they get that name tube worm is because their body actually builds a tube around them that they sort of can retract and hide in. Now, in the case of these special tube worms in the deep, one thing that's unique about them is many of them can get really big and grow really fast. They can get a few feet long in just a year, so 3 or 4 feet really quickly. Now, the amazing thing about these worms, too, is the way that they actually get their energy. And that's because, well, some other types of tube worms, they might feed by actually sort of filter feeding things that come by, right? Or if you're thinking about things like corals in the shallow ocean, sometimes they get their energy by using the sun. But these special worms here have figured out that they actually have a special bacteria in their body that can take that sulfur from the vents and actually turn that into a source of nutrition. Isn't that wild? So these special worms are incredibly adapted to these really amazing deep sea vents. And so here they are, and you can see that they have these sort of red feathery parts that stick out from the tube, and if they ever feel threatened, they can pull themselves back inside of that tube. Now, these are not the only animals that you will find around these deep sea vents. There are many other things too. There might be deep sea squid or deep sea crabs, or in some cases, even deep sea corals. So here's an example of some crabs hanging out there too, and some deep sea corals. So it might be surprising to find that, yeah, we have shallow, really beautiful corals that build coral reefs, but thousands of feet down in the ocean, there are some other different types of corals as well. Isn't that amazing? Now, these special hydrothermal vents create those warm areas, but if you are not by those warm hydrothermal vents, of course the water is going to be much chillier, and so these animals need strategy to do that too. Now, let's think a little bit about our next challenge, which is light, right? Let's look at those different ocean zones and see what it's like as you go deeper into the ocean. Now, scientists, we tend to group these different parts of the ocean by how deep you go, meaning as you go deeper, less and less light. But there's something interesting that happens with color as you go deeper. Now, let's see if we can figure out together what these graphs are telling us. So what we're looking at here on this side is we're going deeper and deeper in the ocean. So up towards the top is the shallow ocean, and then you're going deeper down to the bottom. What do you notice about the colors? What happens as you go deeper? Now on the right side, that's the coastal water, so that's when it's not going very deep at all. But if you keep going down, what happens? Well, why don't we look at blue, for example, blue and teal. It looks like that color goes all the way down. But some other colors seem to disappear. Which color disappears first? Well, that's going to be this one right here, red. Okay, so red. It's not going to be easy to see red when you're down at the deep sea. But why do we care about that? What does that mean for these animals? Well, why don't we take a look at another interesting deep sea fish, the toadfish. And let's see what we can figure out about this interesting fish down in the bottom. And we'll make some connections back to that color, okay? Now, as you can even see here in this picture, right, you can see that even if we go to the deep, if we show some light, right, you can see that blue still is able to make it down to the bottom of the ocean. And so blue can still be visible. But if you were to take an item that's red and take it all the way down into the bottom of the ocean, well, something interesting happens. And that is that color will basically sort of disappear. And so as we look at this next fish, you might see something interesting about its coloration. Now, in this case, this toadfish here has some sort of spots. Now, when you're able to see these pictures, that's not because there is some light down at the bottom. The way we capture these pictures is because scientists go down with these robots, and by adding some light and some flash on their cameras, we can see these animals. But something is so interesting. A lot of these fish down at the bottom have sort of pinkish or red colors. Now, that's not even just true for just these types of toadfish. There are many other critters in the deep sea that have red color. Now, think back to what we looked at the chart. If they're red fish, or even things like a red squid or a red crab, when they're down there in their natural habitat, do you think they actually look red? No, red doesn't show down there. And so if you're a red color with light, like we're seeing in these pictures, but down in the deep sea, you essentially disappear. And so lots of animals in the deep sea will either have dark black or gray colors, kind of like how we saw in the chimera earlier, or a lot of them will be clear or transparent, like jellies, or they might be red, because red, as strange as it is, sort of disappears as you go down to the deep sea. And that's also true for this deep sea shrimp right here. Now this is actually a perfect segue because the next thing we need to talk about with light is something called bioluminescence. Have you heard of bioluminescence before? Bioluminescence means it's a way that an animal can actually make its own light. Now, bioluminescence is actually pretty common in a lot of deep sea animals. So, why would you want to be able to make your own light as a deep sea animal? Can you think of any reasons? As my friend Sergio shows us some of these different examples of bioluminescence, think to yourself, or if you're watching with somebody, why would an animal want to produce its own light? Any ideas? If you have any ideas, feel free to also text them to us. We'd love to hear what you're thinking about as we're exploring the deep sea. Now, bioluminescence, like I said, is actually pretty common and it's found in a lot of animals. There are bioluminescent fish, there are bioluminescent jellies, there are bioluminescent squid, there's even bioluminescent worms, and that shrimp we were looking at earlier also produces bioluminescence. Now, why would an animal want to do that? Well, sort of a mystery. Now, there are some ideas for why these animals might produce bioluminescence. It could be potentially to produce some sort of light to allow these animals to see, even if it's to see briefly. Maybe it's also to attract food. Maybe animals will be driven towards this light. Or maybe it's used as a way to escape. Now, this shrimp that we were looking at, these deep sea shrimp, called pandalid shrimps, these ones actually have a special gland near their mouth that allows them to vomit bioluminescence. I know that sounds kind of gross, but what they're doing is they produce a cloud of bioluminescent glow, like you're seeing in this picture. Now, this might be a way that it uses to escape predators by producing this sort of, dizzying effect with all of that blue light, and so maybe that can get the shrimp to escape. And since we now know about what red looks like at the bottom, you can see that the red shrimp would actually sort of disappear. But blue light that stays would be visible, like in the bioluminescence that it produces. Now, most bioluminescence is typically blue, but there are some cases of bioluminescence being produced in different colors too, like purples and yellows. But most of the time you'll find it like a blue color, just like this. Now, why don't we take a look at some other examples of bioluminescence? Because there's another creature called an ostracod. Now, ostracods are teeny tiny, and what they are they're a special sort of shrimp-like animal, but their shell is really special. They're really teeny tiny, but they have sort of a shell that kind of wraps around them. And these little tiny ostracods can be found in many different parts of the ocean, but can also be found in the deep sea. Now, what's special about these ostracods is, just like these other animals, they're able to produce bioluminescence. Now, we actually have a video that we'd like to show you of some of these ostracods actually producing some bioluminescence. These ostracods can be dried out and preserved, but by breaking down their bodies and allowing those chemicals that make the bioluminescence to be released and mixing it with water, you can get bioluminescence. Why don't we see if we can take a look at that video and watch bioluminescence in action. So in this container, we have some ostracods. And by turning the lights off and mixing with some water, you can see those start to glow. So what you're seeing is bioluminescence in action. As those chemicals have been released from the ostracods and mixed up, so all those tiny little dots that don't really look like anything, that's actually the ostracods. That's how small they are. And by adding just a bit of water and giving it a stir, you can see them glow. And in this case, just like that shrimp, they have the blue glow of their bioluminescence. Pretty amazing, right? Now, you may have also seen before blue waves in the shallow ocean. Here in Southern California, sometimes we have moments where there are blue waves. And that's because those are animals that, even though they're not in the deep sea, they're still able to produce bioluminescence, and it gives it that blue glow as they get stirred up by the water. Now, we have just a couple minutes left. So the last thing that I'd like to show you really quick is how do scientists explore the deep? Because like I said, it's a challenging place to go. I can't just put on a scuba tank and go 4,000 feet down in the ocean. Of course not. That's way too tough to do. So how do scientists study the ocean? How do we know all of this about these different animals? Any ideas? Let's see if Sergio can give us a hint as for how scientists are able to explore this very challenging environment. Well, a lot of the times you have something like this. Any ideas what's on here? Well, this is just one example of the different types of tools that scientists use to explore the deep. Now, in this case, you can actually see that there are some scientists here inside this little bubble with all these fancy, tools all around that allow them to go down into the deep, where it is going to be cold and there is going to be a lot of pressure. Now, these ones have people inside, but a lot of the times there are also other tools like what are called ROVs or AUVs, which are basically underwater robots. And so these underwater robots, like you see here, can sometimes be, or are typically, can be attached, if it's an ROV, to a ship. And as the ship goes down, they can lower this robot down into the deep sea. And by using high-tech cameras and lights, they're able to explore the deep sea. And this is how we get some of those really amazing pictures and videos like we've explored today. Those are all thanks to these really amazing robots that can go down there. They can use their cameras, use their flash to find these different creatures down in the bottom, while you have scientists here controlling and watching all the different pieces as this robot goes on its mission. Now, these robots will often have lots of tools on them as well. So if we ever wanted to bring back up samples from the deep sea, a lot of these robots might have small claws, like you can see here, that are able to sort of break pieces or grab things and bring them back up to the deep. Sometimes they have little vacuums that they can use. So one of the ways we look at deep sea jellies is to actually use a little vacuum and bring them up with us in these tubes, and then we can explore them back here on the shallow, or back here on land or in shallow water, right? And so these things, plus other tools, like we looked at a hydrothermal vent earlier, right? And I told you that water gets like 700 degrees. Well, how did we even figure that out? One of these robots can have these fancy thermometers attached to them and are able to actually get lots of amazing data about what it's like in the deep sea. And so this is just to show you lots of the cool technology, like in here, some different samples of how scientists actually explore this really challenging and really hard to get to habitat. All right, my friends, now we're going to go ahead and wrap up our program today. I want to thank you so much for joining us. If you have any last-minute questions, feel free to use that text line or the email down below, and we'll be sure to get back to you to make sure we answer any of your questions about the deep sea. But I hope you had a great time exploring. I had a great time with you, and we'll see you again next time for another episode of the Aquarium Online Academy. Take care, everyone.